Well, good morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for that kind introduction. I don't know if it was intentional, but they actually left out my stint as president of Southern California Edison. But who knows? In any case, I was describing myself as a former everything to someone this morning, but I actually have a deep and abiding interest in energy efficiency. Years ago, I started out with drafting Title 24, which is the efficiency standards in California. I've had that as a passion of mine for a long time, all through my career. So it's great to be on this stage with Secretary Laird, President Picker, Secretary Rodriguez, and the leaders of California in climate change and carbon reduction. And I want a couple of things. I want to set the tone. I want each of them to make an opening statement, but also interact with one another. And overall, I'd like you to talk about the roles of your respective agencies in meeting our carbon goals, and also the announcement that the governor recently made yesterday about reducing by 40% over 1990 by 2030. That certainly is an ambitious target, and I know all of you have it all figured out already, so I thought you'd give us the roadmap of how that's going to occur. And but it is really an important issue, and I think we have the right people here. As I said, they're leaders in their field, and I just want to begin with a quote from someone on leadership who I think knew a great deal about it, and it does have some political overtones, and all of you should take this to heart. It comes from the great Yankee manager Casey Stengel, who said that the art of leadership is to keep the 50% of the people who hate you away from the undecided. And Picker's shaking his head. He understands that. We'll start off with Secretary Laird, the Resources Secretary, and just again, give us a sense of what you do to meet our AB 32 and what your role may be inside this very ambitious goal of the governor's. John.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I am a bunch of things myself. I'm also a former mayor, and I'm glad they found the one former mayor that's shyer than me to moderate the panel. The Natural Resources Agency is a partner in everything we're doing on climate change. And for the uninitiated, it's 25 boards, commissions, departments, but it includes the Energy Commission, CAL FIRE, which includes forests, parks, water, fish and wildlife, and then oceans, many things that are integrally involved in this. And we play a role that's on both sides of the equation, on emissions, but also we're under an old and yesterday's executive order are the point people on the issues of resilience and adaptation. And so in response to Bob's question, we really, under cap and trade, we're dealing with some projects on water, some projects on forests, some issues on wetlands restoration, and some issues on ag land preservation, all within the purview of our department, all designed to lower greenhouse gas emissions. And we participate in various climate action teams by issues, so that we have a water one, we have one on forests. And one of the things that happened in the economic meltdown that really hit California hard in 2008 and after is many times if it wasn't involved in your core service, it went out the door in the budget cut. So we lost a lot of our forest policy people because all we could do is have the minimum amount of money to fight fires. Well, that's coming back. We are reestablishing forest policy, and over the next year, as a piece of everything that is involved in the governor's executive order, in conjunction with our partners, we will do a forest carbon study. We will do an economic report on the alternative so that we can really look and make sure that what we're doing in forest is targeted, is really reducing emissions. And then on the resilience side, in 2009, the previous administration did an adaptation policy for the state. We re-upped it a year ago with Safeguard in California. That was really a guidance to governments on many different things. And, you know, I chair the Ocean Protection Council. Sea level rise is a big issue for us. We did independent science that shows that in California it would be roughly 14 inches of rise by 2050, nearing 5 feet by 2100. And the interesting word there was the median. So that if we're really successful on the emission side globally, maybe the rise will be less. If we really fail globally, the rise might be more. And the governor's executive order yesterday, for the first time, took some of the adaptation and resiliency to the next step. He basically said that the Office of Planning and Research, based on what we coordinate within the Resources Agency, will work with cities and counties and their general plans and integrate what is going on with adaptation and resilience and what needs to be done in that planning process, and that was part of the order. So that's the broad overview of sort of what we're doing in resources, and I look forward to getting into more detail as the discussion progresses.
We're going to do that. We'll turn to President Picker, who's president of the Public Utilities Commission, who I know the Public Utilities Commission well. They regulate a substantial piece of the California economy, have a great deal to do with efficiency programs, renewable programs of the utilities that they have under their regulation. And Michael, that's a tough job. How do you balance? I mean, one of the things I would ask you to hit in your comments is you've got a tough job of sort of balancing some consumer interests here with environmental policy. And I know that's a tough thing to do. I mean, there's a lot of talk out there of rising consumer prices relative to electricity. And so when you describe what you're doing, you might want to say, how do you wrestle with that animal?
Well, let me describe the challenge that the governor has given to us and then see if I can work back to that. I won't go through the specific goals, but I'll just describe, I think, what it really looks like. If you examine California's carbon budget, and the numbers will shift depending upon which modeler you talk to, but about 20% of our carbon emissions are related to the electric industry. About 30% roughly come from the built environment, homes, commercial buildings, some industrial, and then about 40% comes from transportation. So just on those numbers alone, we are not likely to hit our 2030 goals or our 2050 goals on renewable electricity alone. Unless we eradicate the barriers between electricity and buildings and transportation, and frankly start to see some fuel switching, we are not going to hit our 2030 goal. So that's the big challenge for us. And we sort of serve as an infrastructure financing agency. We award these franchises to utilities to operate, and then we actually guarantee their ability to repay for borrowing to build the infrastructure now by allowing them to recover it in rates through the future. So one of the ways in which we have done that over time, for example, is funding of energy efficiency programs in California, to put the blame back on Bob Foster. Title 24 has been enormously successful. And at the same time that those investments have helped to have caused some of our consumer costs for electricity to rise, we are in the top quadrant of electric rates among the US states. Per capita use of electricity across the last 40 years in California has remained flat. Now, your mileage may vary, but the reality is those investments have caused our electric bills to be in the lowest quadrant. So I think that we're going to start to see some of those other kinds of changes as we start to look at how we invest in some of these other areas. Now, having said that, I'm going to just describe a little bit of our progress on renewable electricity. In the last 5 years, we've actually issued permits to construct and operate, although not contracts, for about 18 gigawatts of renewable electricity, mostly wind and solar, some geothermal, a little bit of biomass. That's about 9 times the peak capacity of either San Onofre or Diablo Canyon. It's a lot of electricity. We've already interconnected around 11 gigawatts. Another 4,000 megawatts is already under permit and beginning construction. We've seen the prices drop as a result of this surge of growth in this particular industry. You can get contracts for solar power above 200 megawatts as cheap as 4.7 cents per kilowatt hour, which competes, at least on energy cost, with a natural gas plant. Not much less coal with modern pollution control devices and carbon capture, which is going to be much more expensive than that. Wind is 3 cents per kilowatt hour in the Midwest, somewhat more expensive here in California. So what we've seen is over the course of the last 5 years is that renewable electricity is becoming a commodity. There is actually a 300 megawatt solar plant being built in the desert without a contract, totally spec. This is a major transformation in that industry. And at this point, we actually don't need the mandatory procurement to force consumption of renewable electricity by our utilities. What we probably ought to do is start to use greenhouse gas reduction as our metric. Greenhouse gas reduction down, reliability up, cost competitiveness. That ought to be our mantra. Because I think then we can start to see how we can begin to make investments across those different industry sectors. Renewable electricity all of a sudden starts to fuel transportation here in LA with light rail or personal electric vehicles. We have the electric utility industry starting to compete with the petroleum industry. We start to see such shifts as are likely here in Southern California with the mandatory requirement of new hot water heaters to be electric in new construction, simply to meet the criteria, air pollutant goals in the state implementation plan. So I think that we start to then have a better and more rational way to actually start to think about investments across all of these platforms. I will say that my agency is not a transportation planning agency. We are not a home construction agency. We are an infrastructure financing agency. I think that there's opportunities for the utilities to participate in financing the infrastructure. We need to bring down greenhouse gas, but we need to see the other pieces of this come together in a way that actually tells us how we do that. And so far, I'm looking for more direction from such agencies as the California Transportation Commission and from local governments in terms of their goals in terms of housing.
Well, thank you. We'll come back to some of that, those questions or those issues, particularly fuel switching, Michael. I'd like to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But Matt Rodriguez, you're the head of EPA. Michael posed a question about transportation fuels, and if you could address two things in your overview of how you're going to help meet our state's goals and now the governor's executive order. One is on transportation fuels, and the other is there seems to be an emphasis on looking at partners out there, international partners or other states. How does that actually work with carbon reduction? How do we join? Do we do it with a memorandum of understanding, or do we actually have a formal relationship, or are we locked in some formal regulatory program with either foreign countries or other states? Matt.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. The role of Cal EPA, we have a variety of roles when it comes to implementing the state's climate change programs. Probably most importantly, the Secretary for Cal EPA is the chair of the Climate Action Team. The Climate Action Team is an attempt to bring together in one room on a regular basis all the boards and departments and agencies in California that touch some part of the climate puzzle, to make sure that we're all talking to each other, to make sure that we're all working collaboratively, to make sure our programs are all in sync with one another. That's a large task, tracking what's going on at the various boards and departments and agencies throughout California. Obviously, Cal EPA has 6 boards, departments, or offices within it, including the Air Resources Board. So a large part of my job is working with the Air Resources Board. Just making sure that I understand, where they're going with things like the scoping plan or some of the other work that they're doing, the low carbon fuel standard. We're very fortunate. We have just an incredible board, an incredible staff at the Air Resources Board. So they're a pleasure to work with. And my role is to think through what questions would the governor ask them if he was sitting and asking them. Okay, he will say, what's the practical implication of this program will be. And so I see it as my job to go through that dialogue with the board, make sure we're thinking about how our programs are going to affect consumers in California. But I've found that they're generally 5 steps ahead of me, so it makes my job easier. But it really is tracking the board and working with them as we go ahead on this very ambitious program. Additionally, my role is to coordinate our work on spending our cap and trade funds. As you know, we've had, I think, 12 auctions to date in our cap and trade program. The last auction, which was a joint auction with the province of Quebec, brought in roughly $650 million to California. So we are in the enviable position of trying to determine how we should be spending that money to accomplish a variety of objectives. The main objective, obviously, is to continue to fund programs that will further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need to do that in order to be consistent with AB 32 and the legislature's direction in AB 32. But there are co-benefits that we can derive from some of these programs. In particular, there was a mention of Senator De Leon's SB 535, which is just directing some of the money from the cap and trade program to disadvantaged communities in California. One of the responsibilities we have at Cal EPA is to identify the disadvantaged communities and make sure that we're directing funds to the right programs in these communities to make sure that they're benefiting from the funding that we're receiving through the cap and trade program. And then it is a question of how do we coordinate what we're doing with other countries and other provinces. I've mentioned that we have linked our cap and trade program with that of Quebec. Just recently, it was announced that Ontario is interested in pursuing a cap and trade program, and it's their intent to have that program linked with the Quebec and California programs. We'll be talking to Ontario about how that might be done. The way we've done it is we do have a memorandum of understanding that we will use to sort of set out the framework for how we can work with one another. And then we make sure that our programs are compatible with one another. And we have set up a nonprofit corporation that actually runs the auctions. And I'm the chairman of the board of directors for that nonprofit corporation. So that's one example of how we can work with other provinces or other states if they're interested. But as you mentioned, we also have recognized that California can't go it alone. We do need to have other partners throughout the world if we're going to deal with what's truly an international problem. And so we have a series of MOUs with the National Development and Reform Commission in China, with individual municipalities or provinces in China, with Peru. We're working with Mexico, and I'll be pleased to make some statements later today about our work with Mexico. And that kind of work really can be described as trading information on how do you establish a emissions trading program? What should it look like? How do you verify emissions reports? How do you enforce your emissions trading programs? How can we deal with other issues such as the common problem that we find throughout the world of pollution from vehicles? How can we have our programs dealing with vehicles both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and deal with the pollution that is the result of transportation systems throughout the world? That's something that we can discuss with the Mexican government, with the Chinese government, with the government in the Netherlands, where we're all wrestling with these issues. I'll just say that we recognize that we need partners, and so we have been willing to sit down with other countries and other governments to discuss our programs and to trade information. But what's been of great interest to me is the number of countries or governments that come to California to ask us about how our programs are working, to find out more about our programs. I think that's indicative of the fact that these programs are thought of highly throughout the world, and people are aware of the fact that California has been able to embark on these programs while at the same time maintaining a strong and healthy economy. You know, we're the 7th largest economy in the world. I view it as part of my job to make sure that we stay there, and to make sure that as we're doing these environmental programs, we are also continuing to look at the economic impacts of these programs to make sure that we're taking that into account. Talking about transportation, just very briefly, as was identified by President Picker, it's a large part of the climate change puzzle in California relates to transportation and emissions from transportation. And so we've got a wide variety of programs to deal with those emissions. That includes the governor's ZEV action plan, that is going to promote electric vehicles in California. Our goal is to have 1.5 electric vehicles on the roads in California by 2025. We also need to reduce our tendency to jump in the car and drive someplace if there are other alternatives. If you can take a bike, or you can walk, or through our membership on the Strategic Growth Council, Secretary Laird and I are going to be looking at grants that we can give to local governments that will help them to plan in a way and carry out programs that will promote sustainable communities. That is, communities where there's a better relationship and linkage between jobs and housing, where there's better public transportation, so that we can reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled within the state. And there are other things we can do as well to promote efficiency in transportation. As you've identified, to promote change in the fuels that we use. At the end of the day, I always tell people, look, I was very fortunate to work for a short period of time with Anthony Eggert, who was a deputy secretary at Cal EPA, and Anthony would say, look, 3 things, just keep in mind. We need to change the fuels that we're using. Let's move away from carbon-based fuels. Let's use our energy more efficiently, so we have to use less of those fuels. And let's do that gut check. I mean, do we need large chandeliers in the building? Can we perhaps cut down on energy and our need for energy? Can we walk more? Can we live differently? And so that sort of covers what we're trying to do when we're looking at transportation.
Well, just to highlight the walk more or not use your car as much, one of the best scenes I've ever seen in the movie was in the movie L.A. Story with Steve Martin. He's going to go visit his neighbor, and he pulls out of his driveway in his house, drives over to the driveway next door, and pulls in. That's how he's going to visit his neighbor. Yeah, it is true. We can certainly use the exercise as well. Now, while I have you here, Michael, I know one of the advantages of being around this energy issue for a long time is I've been through. I worked at the original Energy Commission when it started. I've seen a lot of iterations of the turf rivalry between Energy Commission, PUC, ARB, and all those agencies. But you're involved in something called the Principals Group, and I don't know if people know this, but I will say this. I have never seen state government so coordinated and so working so well as it is today. Largely at the insistence of Governor Brown, but all the people on that are a part of it. And you just explain a little bit about what it is and what it does and how it's helping coordinate.
Well, the energy principles originally were created to draft the first AB 32 scoping plan, and they laid out a whole series of different tasks and then did Gantt charts to show how they matched up and gave some clear direction as to what kind of results we ought to see from them. So, for example, at the PUC, the renewable portfolio standard to increase the use of renewable carbon-free sources of electricity to 33% by 2020, the low carbon fuel standard, the cap and trade programs. And so it became our roadmap. And I came in late to that process, but it became a way that we knew what we had to do together when we had to complete our tasks for other agencies to be able to continue on their tasks. And so that relationship was fairly helpful. I think it became critical at the point that we lost San Onofre, because it was a way that we could actually take our staffs and compare notes on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis to make sure that we were doing those things that each of our agencies had to do in a timely fashion to be able to make sure that the lights stayed on in Southern California. And so since then, we've continued to meet and continued to talk. And so, for example, things like the kind of modeling that I just described for you that talks about the need for actually looking across the big greenhouse emitting sectors in the California economy and to figure out how we phase our actions there so that we have adequate renewable electricity as we begin to replace fuels in transportation and vice versa, just to really begin to actually think about those things together. Because otherwise, agencies in El Monte, in San Francisco, and Sacramento would frequently have a hard time really trying to make sure that we did things on the same calendar and we all arrived at 2020, 2030, or 2050 with our tasks done.
Well, you've done a great job. I mean that sincerely. I've never seen it work as well as it is today, and that's a great benefit. John, I wanted to ask you a question. You mentioned forests and you mentioned open space as a part of carbon reduction. I think even grasslands or something in there. Stuff I don't really know what they are, but can you describe how that works? I mean,
there used to be a couple of plots in southern LA County.
Yeah, there is nothing open in Los Angeles County. I have a hard time finding open space here, but I mean, how does that work in the scheme of reducing carbon or capturing carbon?
Well, it's a really good question, and unfortunately I can begin by describing the complexity. And then you try to figure out where to go, because California has millions and millions of acres of forest land, and yet a majority of it is under the jurisdiction of the federal government. And so the question is how we work with what we can do at the state level and what we can do with federal partners to make sure that our forests are a carbon sink rather than an emitter. And one of the problems we have in the period of climate change is the increasing risk of forest fire. And when you look out of UC Merced, some of the studies that have been done, they just show in the last generation the fire season has expanded in a large way, and that also in the current drought, there are real stresses on forests that lead to emissions, whether it's invasive beetles or other things that sort of take advantage of the drought and lead to a decline in certain trees or species. And so in that context, what is it that we can actually do? And I talked about the efforts we're going to make in the next year to really refine that. But there are certain things that are part of the complexity, which is the federal government has a different view on fires in some ways than the state does. And part of it is that the state has to defend urbanized areas. The federal government generally has the wide open spaces without urbanized areas there. So it's trying to demonstrate, because whether it's cap and trade or any other action plan, we have to actually reduce emissions. And you have to demonstrate that you actually are preventing a fire in a clear way in how you might do forest preparation. But you also have biomass, you have other things that are options, and sometimes biomass seems to me like those of us that contemplate offshore renewable energy. A lot of people are for it, and yet in California there's never essentially been a project, and so everybody can be for it without it ever having happened. And
perfect.
Yeah. Oh, as an elected official, occasionally I would lust for those situations. But the thing with biomass is, how can we complete the cycle and have some in place and have it demonstrating that it's working and producing and creating a market, so that you can kind of put it in part of the cycle and really move it ahead. So we have some big challenges in forests, and of course, wetlands in certain ways. California, when Europeans arrived in California, we have 10% of the wetlands that they found here when they arrived. And so in restoration, how they fit in the Sierra, in the water system, other places, it's not just good for water in the system, it's really good in relation to emissions. California's ag land protection efforts have flagged in recent years. And there's always the debate about how they fit, but obviously an acre of ag land is much less emissions in most cases than an acre of urbanized land. So how do we figure out all these things in a documentable way that shows that we're reducing emissions, where it's doable, and in many ways where we can take limited resources and effort and try to figure out what is the maximum way of dealing with it there. And so it's a big challenge, and I think in some ways, even though California seems to be ahead of many places, I think within the context of our scoping plan, with the context of cap and trade, we're a little behind in some of these areas, and we're rushing to catch up.
Thanks. Matt, I have a tough question for you. You mentioned, and Michael mentioned this too, with fuel switching, but you mentioned electric vehicles. Now, I am one of those people, an early adopter of an electric vehicle. I drove a all-electric RAV4 for about just about 11 years. I love that car, but I had something called range anxiety, which probably still have it for all I know. And you know, it has a 70, 75 mile range, and you always have to live within that. And I drive a Volt most times now, and I've shed the range anxiety, and I'm actually getting about 240 miles per gallon in that Volt. It's a great car. How are we going to get 1.5 million electric vehicles? What are we going to do to get that done? I always believe it's the future, and yet I still, you know, you talk to your friends and neighbors and people you know, and it's always, you know, but it runs out of juice in 200 miles or 100 miles or whatever. And what do we do?
First off, let me note that I think we're over 120,000 ZEVs on the road right now in California. So we are making significant inroads, if you will, into you know, achieving our goal. Most of it is, I think, familiarizing the public with ZEVs and what they can do, and have people realize that you know, the average commute, I think, if back and forth to work is, you know, 35, somewhere in that range, 35 miles, well within the range of most of the ZEVs. And so while there is some range anxiety, if you really look at how you use cars, I think that for most purposes, a ZEV will be just fine, particularly in our urbanized areas. So it is just getting them out on the road, letting people see them, and making sure that we're doing what we can to provide the infrastructure. That's where the use of some of the cap and trade funds will be helpful as well. deal with that concern about where am I going to find a charging station and how should this work. So we need to provide the infrastructure, and we need to continue to both incentivize purchases and also work with the car companies to let them know that we're interested in working with them to promote this change in technology. Can you have changes in technology like this? Absolutely. I was reading a book, actually, it was about Lawrence of Arabia, but there was a portion in it where
high camel emissions.
yeah. There was a discussion about how Standard Oil was looking for oil deposits in the Middle East in and around 1913, 1914. And one of the reasons for that was because there was a sense that we had tapped into all the easy to find oil deposits in the United States, and you needed to find other sources. But that was necessary because of this tremendous growth in combustion engine cars. I think the figure that they used in the book was that in 1905 there were 75,000 combustion engine cars in the United States. By 1913, 8 years later, there were 1.5 million. So we've seen these changes. We're not always attuned to them. When you're in the middle of the change, you don't always pick up. But we've seen these rapid changes in technology. I think that we're going to see one here. I think that there's a tremendous innovation going on in the auto industry. And so I think that there will continue to be improvements in battery technology and improvements in charging technology. And I think that that will carry us forward and help us to achieve our goals. And I'll note again that we're not alone in my discussions with other countries. The Netherlands, the UK, Portugal, Germany. There are many countries that are interested in promoting ZEVs and electric vehicles in particular. We're all discussing how do we provide that infrastructure, how do we provide the incentives to encourage the purchase of those cars. And I'll just leave by telling a story that really struck me, and that was I was in China last year, and I was asked if I wanted to see a charging station, and I said, well, I've seen charging stations before, but sure, let's go see this charging station. You forget the scale of China. A charging station in China was a 3-megawatt facility with 30 fast chargers. For buses and taxis. Yeah. All the buses and taxis were made in China. And it would take, I was told, 3 to 4 hours to do a bus, 1 to 2 hours to charge the taxi, get it back out on the road. I asked about fast charging, whether that would reduce the life of the battery. They said yes, but we're committed to doing this. We want these vehicles out on the road. This is one of the keys for us to deal with our emissions problems with autos. And so we're committed to going ahead and promoting these electric vehicles. And so it's not something we're just doing here in California. There's a great deal of interest internationally. And that's one of the things that I think will be intriguing about the possibility of working with Ontario. As Minister Murray likes to point out, Ontario is the seat of the auto industry in Canada. And we're interested in working with them to see what we can do to get Ontario, Quebec, more interested in promoting zero-emission vehicles and work with their auto industry in Canada as well as here in the United States and in Mexico as well.
Michael, by the way, if any of you want to ask a question of each other, just go at it.
We see each other all the time.
Yeah, I can understand how that would wear on you.
I shouldn't have sounded so weary when I said that. Yeah, now we're here again.
I'm just kidding.
And so am I when I say if we ever ask one of them, what the hell are you thinking? That's something we do privately.
Yeah. Michael, you mentioned fuel switching. I mean, tell me a little bit about that. What needs to happen?
Well, I think that, again, we tend to think in silos based on our statutory authorities and our relative missions. And so I think we really have to start to look outside of our experience and our precedent particularly for those of us who have a base in legal tradition or regulatory law. That's all backward looking. And we're seeing rapid innovation, and we have to figure out how we keep pace with that. So I'll just give two examples. We're gonna face a problem of too much renewable electricity certain times of the day, certain times of the year, and that could be a problem from an engineering perspective, having too much electricity in a closed loop system. Normally, what we do is curtail, and we actually have been curtailing renewable electricity here in California simply because on certain days last year, we just had too much of it. Fuel switching actually gives us an opportunity to take advantage of that, and I'm going to go back to this electric water heater suggestion. During that period of 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., when all of our solar photovoltaics are firing off in large scale and rooftop, and we have too much electricity in various parts of the system, that's a perfect opportunity to heat water, store it in a 40-gallon tank rather than a 24-gallon tank, and then begin to use that as a way to soak up excess electricity early in the day and supply customers' needs later in the day. If you take it to the next step, it becomes a demand resource rather than a supply resource, because you can actually begin to monitor how people are using that, and you can give them reminders and actually begin to manage that demand as part of your electrical system. Here's the thing that we need to think through. If we continue to finance these kinds of efforts in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment solely on the avoided cost of electricity, which is the test that we currently use for energy efficiency investments, that kind of a technology wouldn't fit because it's actually increasing demand for renewable electricity. And so here's where our precedent, here's where our past successes actually begin to inhibit us from moving forward in the future. Similarly with electric vehicles, when you get a stipend from your utility to do a charging facility, usually as a homeowner and an electric vehicle owner, you can only do that on your own property. But that may not necessarily help us with that 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. excess generation. We need workplace charging. Where are the workplaces that we should be focusing on? If our goal is reducing range anxiety, improving reliability in the system, reducing cost, we really need to rethink that. And I don't know that putting them in Whole Foods stores is really going to be the solution to our transportation needs. And that's why I say that we have to actually stop doing things the way we've always done it in this really dynamic new world if we want to make our 2030 goals.
And you know, just to pick up on that, because in the area of land management or resources management or forests, the exact same principle applies. And if you just take the people that in state government that deal with forests, they historically think of themselves as firefighters and other things, and they actually think in the context of the bureaucracy, if they just tied to highway patrol officers because they're public safety people, they'd get paid more. And they don't understand that actually the future for them is in climate change and resources management, that people would look at them in a much broader way, and they have to not look at the past and look at the future in thinking, okay, how do we manage forests in a carbon sense in a way that ironically state government will invest in us more, and in which they have to think completely differently than they have going forward. And so I was speaking to the 120 top managers in CAL FIRE, and I could see them all running it by and thinking about it, because in some ways you have to work in their own interest, but really the state interest. And I have been stuck a lot of times because we had a parks meltdown about we have as I said, an ag land program that's flagging, and we don't really have adequate money to deal with the wetlands that we manage as the state. And I was always looking for how do we have sustainable funding in the stewardship of public lands. And except for the historic parks or the cultural parks, almost everything that's in that category is a climate change issue, either in emissions or resilience. And if you start to fit it in that, then suddenly you have a whole different way of looking at it. People have a whole different self-image and how they contribute to everything that we're doing and talking about here across the menu. It has a role, and that's just not the way anybody thought about it when they came into the service. And so it's trying to get them to think differently and do it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I have to tell you, there's a number of bills, or at least one I know by the Pro Tem De Leon on increasing the renewable standard from 33 to 50. And while I'm most of everybody in this room and certainly on this dais would applaud that, we have to think about it differently than that today, because where we are in the overgen situation, where now you've all grown up with give your appliances the afternoon off and all that stuff. Well, now it's work the hell out of your appliances during the afternoon because it's a dynamic system. And we can't take just one part of an electric system and pump it up and expect it not to have consequences, and sometimes very unintended consequences elsewhere. And again, I know the principals group is about this as a system. How do we get a standard that really deals with all this complexity? And I applaud that, because if we continue to go down the path we're going, we will not make our goals. It will not work the way it's done in the past. So I really do. I applaud all of you for doing that. I do want to leave some time for questions. I think there's a mic out there somewhere. Did I read that right? Anyone has a question, would you come up and just introduce yourself and ask a really embarrassing question to one of these people?
And direct it to the moderator.
Yeah.
Oh, please. Fred Keeley used to always do that. Remember that? He'd always would address the chairman with the question. I thought that was pretty cool, actually.
Hi, I'm Brian Speck from Portland General Electric. We're really hot on this water heater idea, is what. So we've been working, trying to work with BPA on issues in our neck of the woods. It seems to me that there's a tremendous opportunity to amend Title 24 to promote standards that allow responsive appliances. Is that something you've thought about?
Well, first of all, I have to tell you, I had the same, the minute Michael said, we're going to promote electric water heating, I spent a good deal of my life fighting electric water heating because it was considered to be inefficient, nowhere near as efficient as gas, and now we have other issues that we're dealing with. So, and the technology's changed. But tell us, do we amend Title 24? Do we get some demand response here? Are we going to have pricing policies that will help?
I have to say that I use that as an example of how innovation and technologies are changing. Electric water heaters are widely used throughout the Northeast, and actually Congress just changed the federal standards to allow them to be used as a demand resource and procured in the wholesale markets. So it's on my mind simply because it's a question that will come back to us in a variety of ways. I think that there's still a lot of questions that we have to answer. I was, for a short period of time, director of Sacramento Municipal Utility District, which has a table here, and they finally abandoned their all-electric tariffs, and simply because there just wasn't enough demand. A lot of this is not within the realm of the utility industry or electricity policy. It really falls squarely into housing policy, which is really what Title 24 is. It sets building code standards. And so that's not an easy thing for the Public Utilities Commission to do alone. We need to have legislative authorization. We need to have a lot of work with the building industry. If we're going to start to drive these things into the bulk of California housing, which was built before the Title 24 standard. We're going to have to deal with a lot of existing homeowners in the realty industry. So I think that these are really broad discussions, and all I'm trying to do is give examples to tell people that it's not going to be easy to deal with all this in one place. You can't just tell the PUC, go out and make more energy efficiency. There's practical limits unless you engage housing policy and all the participants there.
And the other thing is the guy that's in charge of water deliveries in the driest 4 years in recorded history in California, and who lives on weekends in the city that was 45 gallons per person per day in usage at the height of the summer last year. When you're dealing with running when you're not on demand response water heaters and you're running the water to get it hot, you're losing a gallon or two of your 45 during the day. And that just goes to the larger issue of what's the nexus between water and energy, which is something that we are all approaching in this. And when Michael says legislative, it's before its time. In my 6 years in the Assembly, I was the water conservation person, and so I did all this stuff, and the building code, because of special interest carve-outs, made it illegal to have a waterless urinal or a dual flush toilet in California, and I did the language that changed that, and that is exactly where it had to come to happen, and yet that was saving millions of gallons of water, and then with the nexus to electricity, that is an emission savings by doing that. And so in the broader discussion that Michael's talking about, it's all those things and all those parties that act on that.
Just to put one fine note on demand response, which was part of your question, I'll get to. I think one of the most exciting things that's happening in the private sector is a whole lot of technology is now coming to the fore. I work with a company that actually has an app that can tell you what each of your appliances is using in real time, and also can aggregate those users. And if we had pricing policies that would incent people to use more or less at various times, that can be transferred to people, and it's demand response that you can count on at some level. I think you're going to see technology really enter this field and provide a lot of benefit. Yes.
You can be next, Louis. Hi, Wendy James, Better World Group. I think this is probably a follow-up to the previous question, but President Picker mentioned the 30% associated with the built environment. And I don't know whether maybe Secretary Laird, since you have the Energy Commission, might be a better one to respond. But I know last time that the Energy Commission tried to go after point-of-sale requirements on energy conservation. The real estate industry knocked it down because we were, going through this housing crisis. But now we're seeing real estate prices that are hitting historic highs. Is this maybe a point in history where we could try that? LA has probably had the success we've had on water conservation because of point of sale, and it's tough. But is this the right time to try to do that?
You're a tough guy. You can do that.
I'm getting it from all sides. And apropos of Casey Stengel, I'd just be happy if it was just 50%. where there was a problem. The irony in your question is that in my last year in the legislature, I tried the point of sale bill. And it blew up due to the real estate industry. And the question has always been, how do you make sure the energy audits happen and the actions follow from them, so that if somehow you can't do point of sale, how do you just make sure it happens? It's just that point of sale is the most logical way to do it, and it makes it happen. And I think there in some quarters is a little bit of a softening, and I think now, just given everything, we have to look at it again and see if there in fact is.
I think there's another issue that really you all have to address in part, which is that the kind of political coalitions and demands that resulted in the success of the renewable portfolio standard and drove this new renewable energy development industry, that we have to not simply focus on our past successes. There's got to be much more demand from all the stakeholders out there that we begin to look at these other kinds of opportunities and not just continue to hold on to our past victories. You can't get to heaven without strong winds and a fierce heart here. So guys, just because it worked doesn't mean your job is over. You got to go further.
Well, the first 2 years of the administration, I was trying to get to heaven on water policy. Nobody was paying any attention whatsoever. And last year we had the most productive year in water policy in modern history with groundwater, the bond, the water action plan, better operations, better conservation. And I think what is happening with the governor's order and with people at this conference is we are trying to create those wins so that traditional divisions aren't the same and there is energy behind this. And I think the question is really not the three of us on the panel, but it's all of you, and whether or not that kind of energy is going to come to change those things.
We'll take one more, and then we're going to run out of time. Just one more.
Well, I'd like to thank my colleague, Jonathan. It's wonderful news yesterday and wonderful news today to hear Secretary Laird talk about the role of the forest and the landscape in addressing the governor's emission reduction target. And Ken Alex reminded us yesterday, as you did as well, as the governor's inaugural address had 5 pillars, and the reduction by 50% for energy efficiency, transportation fuels, and renewables were 3 pillars, and one was the short-lived carbon pollutants and climate pollutants, and the 5th was the land base. And the land base, as you alluded to, is new data shows that we may be seeing a source of emissions from our land base. And I wondered if you've given any sort of thought, if you could project what contribution conservation of natural and working lands could provide to meeting the 40% reduction target. And if adopting some kind of goal like 30% reduction in acres burned and 30% reduction in land use converted to develop might help set in motion the activities that would produce those reductions.
Very good question, very good formulation. And I think that's our challenge for the next years, to figure out if we can do that. And if we can do it, what is the logical target? How does it break down with the different kind of land-based emissions? And in looking at the other things that we're talking about that are not the land-based emissions, how does it fit? What is the piece? And in many ways, it might kind of drive some of the goals we have to set. And if maybe as a closing thing here, because I know we're running out of time, if I can just talk for a second about goals. Because the interesting thing to me is that usually people feel like if you set a goal, you have to know exactly what fits under it and how you're going to get places. But if you look back at the most recent goals that have been set in state government, I mean, I was a mayor in 1988 when the bill passed to divert 50% waste from the landfills. And I thought, oh, good luck with that. You know, more power to you. Well, we now divert 60. And the landfill in 1981, when I took the oath to the city council, our landfill that had 22 years life on it, 34 years later has over 30 years life, because we set the goal in ways we didn't understand we did it. And I did a bill, 20% per capita reduction in water use by 2020. I had to negotiate the first half and how we're going to do it. And I sort of gave up and said, we'll check in halfway and figure out how to do it at the end. Well, we're on target to meet that. And the other goals that were mentioned, whether it's the renewable portfolio standard or AB 32, we are on target to meet. And so in some ways, it is setting these goals, having a good idea how we'll get there, but not know everything, because there'll be some improvements in technology. There'll be some things that motivate people that we don't understand yet. And the important thing in many ways is setting a goal that is realistic. And that's what the governor did yesterday. That's what he did in his speech in January. And that's what we will try to do with the land-based emissions when we take the hard study over the next 12 months and decide whether and how to set a goal.
Well,
I agree. We have not had a greenhouse gas goal at the PUC. We've had various energy goals. We need to adopt one, and we need to start to look at how our programs actually move us towards achieving those goals. You're right.
Couldn't agree more. I want all of you join me in thanking what a great panel we had here today. Thank you very much, gentlemen.